So peace cannot be achieved by one country. It requires cooperation of neighboring countries as well. So beyond border, we need to build trust and we need to have communication. And that will bring long-lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. That's why this forum is even more significant. And the peace on the Korean Peninsula is not just a regional issue, but it's an issue that the international community should address. Now let us move on to the first plenary session. And this session, the theme is the crisis of democracy and the challenge of peaceful coexistence. And the keynote speech will be delivered by Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard University, who is world-renowned author of Justice and Democracy's Discontent. And it will be followed by a dialogue with Mr. Kim Gi-jung, president of the Middle Class Society. In this session, we will reflect on the crisis facing liberal democracy and the geopolitical instability that arises from it, and together explore value-based responses and policy directions. In particular, Professor Sandel's keynote will offer a philosophical perspective on the relationship between democracy and peaceful coexistence, making this a meaningful opportunity to discuss both policy and ethical dimensions. So let us now invite our keynote speaker. Let us welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. Minister Chung, President Kim, distinguished scholars and policy experts, ladies and gentlemen, and especially, as Minister Chung was pointing out when we were taking the photos, we saw a lot of young people here who showed up, and I want to welcome them as well, because the way you think about the prospect of peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula will decide the future. And so will the way you think and act in response to the challenges that democracy faces today. Now, the subject of this session is the crisis of democracy and challenges to peaceful coexistence. You might think that these are two separate questions, two separate challenges. Because democracy is what happens within countries, within democratic countries, and peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula, that's about the relation between North and South. So what I would like to suggest is that there is actually a connection between these two challenges. I'm just a philosopher. This room is filled with policy experts and scholars who have devoted careers to trying to bring about peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula. I am a friendly outside observer who is rooting for you to succeed. I'm not an expert on how to achieve it. I do think that peace on the Korean Peninsula is of enormous importance, not only geopolitical importance, but also of moral importance. And not only for South Korea, and not only for Northeast Asia, but also for the world. Because world peace and world coexistence is very much at stake here. And so what you are engaged in is a noble project and a morally necessary one. Now, I've already confessed to my limitations as a mere philosopher. I don't have the answers in how to achieve peaceful coexistence, but what philosophers have to offer, if anything, are questions. Questions that can sometimes inform our thinking and the way we act in the world. Now, let's begin with an obvious observation, which is the Korean Peninsula is a dangerous neighborhood. North Korea has nuclear weapons and now declares that inter-Korean relations involve two states hostile to each other. That's dangerous. And debates have begun, the debates have been long-standing, about what is realistic to aim at. And South Koreans disagree and have debates about how realistic is the prospect of unification, whether the focus should be on peaceful engagement. But as this debate proceeds, what I would like to suggest, or the question I would like to pose, is what is the connection between the crisis of democracy today and the search for peaceful coexistence? To begin to think about this, and I hope we can think about this together, because after this talk, we're going to have a dialogue, and after the dialogue, we're going to have an opportunity for questions, aren't we? So, consider this the beginning of a dialogue. Let's begin by asking, what is coexistence? What is it that we're aiming at? I think there are three answers, possible answers to this question. At its most minimal, peaceful coexistence is simply the absence of war, the absence of violence. It's living in proximity without fighting and killing. It's putting up with one another, but not more than that. It simply means holding back from engaging in violence. That's a very minimal definition of peaceful coexistence. There's a second conception of coexistence that's a little bit more ambitious, morally and politically. The second conception of coexistence is living together side by side, living different lives, perhaps under different systems of government, according to different ideals, but with a kind of mutual respect. The kind of mutual respect that at least acknowledges the legitimacy of the other. So call this the coexistence of mutual respect. It's more than simply desisting from violence, and yet it's something less than a third conception of coexistence, which is about community, about sharing a common life. It's about living together, seeking common purposes and ends, not agreeing on everything. No society agrees on everything. No family agrees on everything. But living together in a way that is bound by a sense of belonging, by the sense that we are in this together, that we have mutual obligations, a shared identity, a shared destiny. So we might call this third, more ambitious, well, the most ambitious conception of coexistence, coexistence as community or as shared identity. Now, here's the question, or at least the first question I'd like to ask, as we consider these three different kinds of coexistence. Which of these three is a reasonable goal for inter-Korea relations? And second question, which of these modes of coexistence describes or should describe the relation within a state of democratic citizens? Now, ideally, you might say, well, the third. Doesn't democracy require a sense of community, of belonging, of shared purpose, of mutual obligation for one another? And yet, if you look at politics in democratic societies today around the world, in Korea, in the United States, and in many democratic societies in Europe, in Latin America, we fall quite a bit short, don't we, of this third idea of coexistence as community. In fact, it might even be asked whether democracies today live up even to the second, more modest idea of living together with mutual respect and acknowledging the legitimacy of the other. Is it obvious that this mode of coexistence describes democratic life in South Korea, in the United States, in Britain, France, Germany? Well, here I'll speak for the United States. It's not obvious. And you'll decide what the answer to that question is for South Korea. That's not for me to say. Now, here's an even more frightening prospect. Are we confident that in democracy today, in democratic societies today, we have at least the first mode of coexistence? Given the intense, deep polarization that afflicts our societies and our politics. And here, I think I can speak safely of South Korea and the United States at least. How confident can we be that we even live up to coexistence in the sense of the lack of political violence? We've seen examples, haven't we, of a growing tendency toward political violence, not just rude public discourse, but attempted assassinations. We've seen that recently in South Korea and in the United States. And what makes these instances of political violence. We saw the assault of January 6th on the U.S. Capitol, a violent assault. We saw a violent assault on the Supreme Court here in South Korea during the impeachment deliberations. So, what do we make of the fact that even the most minimal aspiration for coexistence that arises when we're talking about relations between countries or seemingly or states at odds with one another, that even that minimal coexistence seems now in doubt within our democracies. And that's cause for concern and a reason to think through what it would take to address the polarization that calls coexistence into question not only between states, but even within democratic societies. Now, I want to begin by acknowledging something that we too often take for granted. 3 great achievements of the Republic of Korea in its 80 years since independence. First, its economic transformation into one of the leading economies of the world. It came about through enormous sacrifice of earlier generations, but it is an astounding achievement. Second, and this is a more recent achievement since 1987, a successful democracy with democratic institutions and democratic norms. And third, enormous cultural success. A popular culture that has dazzled the world. From K-pop to movies like Parasite, to television programs like Squid Game, and even now to K-pop Demon Hunter, though I haven't seen it, so don't ask me about it. But K-pop culture has dazzled the world. Of these 3 achievements, the most precious, but also the most precarious, is the democratic achievement. This is my first visit to South Korea since the astounding events of the last few months, since the declaration of martial law, since the repeal of martial law, the impeachment, and the election. And I think that those who love democracy around the world were inspired by the revolution of light that showed the persistence of democratic ideals and the willingness of millions of people to sustain and insist on those democratic ideals and institutions. Not only standing outside with those sticks of light, insisting on the preservation of democracy, but also turning out in impressive numbers in the June election, nearly 80% turnout, which is a better turnout in a presidential election than the United States has ever had. The best we've had is 66%, 79.4% in South Korea. Now, this is all deeply inspiring. And yet, my Korean friends, I find, are asking themselves a question. It's all very inspiring. It seems that the danger has passed, that we're back to normal, that we had a democratic election, that the threat, the peril of democracy has receded. But, my Korean friends say, are we sure about that? Or does the danger to democracy persist, especially when we consider the hyper-polarization and partisanship that afflicts Korean public life? And in the United States, we have to ask ourselves a similar question. We were reassured for a time because a president who lost, who was voted out in 2020, he insisted the election was stolen. He prompted a mob to attack the US Capitol on January 6th. But he did finally leave. And the person who won the election took office. And those who rioted were convicted. Back to normal, we thought. The danger passed. Democracy is alive and well. Or was it? Or is it? Because President Trump won re-election and he pardoned the rioters. And he attacks the media as enemies of the people. And he attacks universities by trying to withhold their funds and prevent us from enrolling students from abroad. My university in particular at this moment. And perhaps worst of all, most worrisome of all, he is unleashing masked agents unaccountable to deport non-citizens, including, as we just learned, some 300 South Korean workers who are setting up a battery factory in Georgia, treating them as if they were criminals. So, how confident can we be that democracy has been delivered from its danger in the United States? The reason the danger persists in both of our countries is that both countries are polarized to the point where even peaceful coexistence in the first minimal sense of avoiding violence, even that coexistence is in doubt. And we've just had the latest episode in this when we see the aftermath of the assassination of a young man, a young articulate MAGA advocate named Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated, and it's unleashed a torrent of accusation. Just a few days after he visited South Korea to try to spread his message here. So, to make coexistence possible within democratic societies, we have to figure out how to address the polarization. And to do that, we have to diagnose it. What's its source? Now, some of the sources may differ as between South Korea and the United States. In the case of South Korea, some of the partisan polarization may result from attitudes that were shaped some time ago during the period of colonialization, the Second World War, the Cold War, the Korean War, differing attitudes of the parties toward Japan and toward North Korea and toward the United States. That's part of it. I understand that's a distinctive feature of the polarization in this country. But some sources of the polarization, I think, are shared, and it's worth trying to understand them, especially when we consider the greater tendency of young men in their 20s and 30s, especially those without a college degree, to feel angry, disempowered, a sense of grievance, and resentment. And we see this in both countries. And we see that resentment turned to a tendency to support authoritarian populist figures. How could we begin to address that source of the polarization? I think we need to recognize that some of the grievances that animate that anger are understandable, even legitimate, because over the last few decades, during the era of neoliberal globalization, inequality, economic inequality has deepened. Wages, in the case of the United States, wages for the median worker have been stagnant in real terms for 5 decades. Even as globalization delivered enormous economic growth, it went mostly to the top 20%. The bottom half received almost none of the increased economic growth. That's over 5 decades. But it's not only about economic inequality. It's about inequality of recognition, respect, dignity, and esteem. It's about the gap. It's not only about the gulf between rich and poor, it's about the gap between winners and so-called losers. Because in recent decades, that divide has deepened. And the reason it's deepened is connected, paradoxically, to the enormous role that education plays and has come to play in our economies and in our societies. And this is true in the United States and in South Korea. South Korea leads the world in the percentage of its people who have college degrees. And that is a remarkable thing. The United States is also among the leaders, but not as high as South Korea. And yet, the widening inequalities and the growing gulf between winners and losers is connected to the growing importance and centrality of education. I read some surveys asking South Korean college students how they regard their high school years. 81% chose the option that said they would describe it as a battlefield of life and death. This is the pressure, the intense competitive pressure that market-driven meritocracies like ours produce. 50% of parents, South Korean parents, said they didn't want their children to have a similar educational experience to the one they endured because of the intensity of the competitive pressure. And 42% in one of these surveys said that respect in the society, respect depends on educational achievement. We saw this during the age of globalization. We were told that if you're worried about the widening inequality, the answer is to go get a degree. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. Politicians of the center left and center right, certainly in the United States, intoned this slogan to the point of cliché. What they missed was the insult implicit in it. The insult was this: if you're struggling in the new economy and you didn't go to college, your failure must be your fault. The problem is not with the economic policies that led to the widening inequalities, it's that you didn't equip yourself to compete and win in the global economy through education. So the intense competitive pressure of educational systems and the competitive meritocracies in South Korea and in the United States, that's what creates the divide between winners and losers. The economy created the gulf between rich and poor. The market-driven meritocracy and the educational pressures created the divide between winners and losers. And that divide is what gives rise to the sense among many working people and many of those young men without degrees, the sense that elites, especially well-credentialed elites, look down on them, don't respect the dignity of their work. And so they reach for figures who channel their grievances. And often, in channeling the grievances, they become entangled with ugly sentiments like xenophobia and racism. But we need to disentangle the legitimate grievances from the ugly sentiments with which they are often entangled. So, if something like this diagnosis is right, the only way we're going to change the terms of public discourse is to focus more on the dignity of work, to address economic inequality seriously, to change attitudes towards success so that those without degrees can enjoy respect for the contributions they make, and create class-mixing institutions that bring us together from different walks of life. That's one of the things we've lost. Now, we can discuss perhaps in the dialogue what that might look like, how we might begin to heal the polarization that makes democracy still an endangered practice. But I want to conclude by coming back to the question with which we began. What is the connection between the crisis of democracy and the challenges to peaceful coexistence? My suggestion is this. In a democracy like South Korea, it won't be possible to decide what kind of coexistence with North Korea is possible and desirable without democratic dialogue and debate. But it won't be possible to have that dialogue and debate until we do something about the deep, intense polarization that exists and prevents it. And social media makes it worse. We can talk about that perhaps in the discussion. In short, deciding what kind of peaceful coexistence South Korea should pursue depends on finding a way to heal the polarization that keeps democracy in peril. Finding a way. What we need to do, in other words, in all of our democratic societies, is to find our way to a more peaceful, less polarized coexistence within our countries, not only between them. Thank you all very much. All right.
네, 감사합니다. 오늘
Thank
기조
you so
가견을
much.
마이클 샌들 교수님께서
Professor
먼저
Michael
해주셨습니다.
Sandel
이
for
평화로운
delivering your keynote
공존에 대한
speech.
개념에 대해서
You
말씀을
have mentioned
해주셨는데요.
about the
우리
peaceful
민주주의
coexistence and that all democratic countries have to lead those efforts. And also, Professor has mentioned about the coexistence as a community as well as peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula, and also about the international common good. And he has also mentioned that all the countries have to think carefully about the peaceful coexistence, that it shall be a universal value that every country shall pursue. And I've also mentioned earlier that we should not be confined to a certain country's interest, because peace transcends borders and all the countries need to think about peaceful coexistence. And when this happens, then can we see prosperity and cooperation of Northeast Asia, and also can we promote peace on the global arena. And Professor Sandel has also mentioned about the concept of morality and how that can contribute to the peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula. And now we will move on to the discussion between Professor Sandel and also with Professor Kim. And so we will be also having a Q&A session later on. So for those of you who have any questions, please do raise your hand after our discussion, and we will hand over the microphone to you. Now we have Professor Sandel, which is a rare opportunity for all of us. So I hope you can share your insights and opinions.
네, 그럼 지금부터 이 MCS
So from now on, President Kim Ki-jung, who is the president of the Middle Class Society and who is also the former president of Institute for National Security Strategy, will have a discussion with Professor Michael Sandel. Please welcome them with a big hand.
Hello, my name is Ki-jung Kim. I'm working as an interlocutor of this plenary session to have a discussion with Mr. Sandel. Thank you very much for being here. We have a very limited time, and my role would be also very limited. But let me start with the, as you mentioned, the connection between the democracy and peace.
Yeah.
It reminds us that very famous speech of the President Woodrow Wilson. He made a speech in 1917. The world should be safe for democracy.
Right.
So the two questions would be inevitable. Looking back to 100 years or more, are we safer now? Are we living in a more safer world? If not, what would be the reasons that the even safety or peace would be endangered?
Yeah. I would say, with all due respect to Woodrow Wilson, that the world is never safe for democracy. And the idea that we could go to war, fight a world war, he was talking about the First World War, and achieve once and for all a world safe for democracy was a kind of hubris on his part. Because what it misses, what it forgets, is that democracy is a hard achievement, an achievement whose requirements vary one time and place to another, one country to another. Democracy is not a permanent thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea that we could fight a war and make the world safe for democracy was naive and hubristic and the wrong way to think about what democracy requires. It requires hard work. It's fragile, as we've seen. We've identified.
We should learn too.
And it requires learning, continual learning, actually. That's an important point. So I think it's folly to think that we could fight a war and render the world safe for democracy.
But as a political scientist myself,
yes,
we have a very famous theory to connect to different things, democracy and peace. Democratic peace theory. Do you still believe that the making the democratic states safe would be precondition for the peace, the regional peace or the world peace.
It is true that democracies don't go to war with one another very often, but even on that, there's no guarantee. So I'm a little bit skeptical, but perhaps you'll disagree with me about this. I'm a little bit skeptical of political science theories that try to identify once and for all the necessary and sufficient conditions of world peace or of democracy. I think we know what it looks like and what it feels like to fight for democracy and to seek peace in a given time and a given place. But what makes it so difficult is that there is no recipe, no fixed recipe.
So it is still, we should believe that even the democracy is still evolving.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, one of the main topic that you mentioned in your speech is that our democracy and your democracy is in jeopardy. It is endangered. But in looking back the 20th century in world politics, we see the many touchstones that the United States, political leaders has made. For instance, the Woodrow Wilson's the speech that I mentioned.
Yes.
Or Franklin Roosevelt for freedom speech.
Yes.
It's also very monumental speech.
Yes.
And even, the Jimmy Carter's human rights diplomacy. But in now in 2025, what's happening in the U.S.? What's wrong with you now?
What's wrong? We're struggling. We are struggling. And we're in trouble. And one of the reasons we're in trouble, it's not just that Donald Trump arrived and started putting democracy in question and violating democratic norms. That's a problem. But that's not the source of the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. I think what opened the way for the populist backlash against elites in the United States is that for 4 or 5 decades, well, since the 1980s at least, elites did a pretty poor job of governing. And in particular, they embraced a version of hyperglobalization or neoliberal globalization that insisted on the flow of people, capital, and goods across borders on the theory, backed up by mainstream economists, that everyone would gain. And if there were some who gained more than others, the gains to the gainers could be used and redistributed to offset the loss of those who face stagnant wages and job loss and hollowed out industrial communities, as turned out to be the case. But that compensation never arrived. The winners used their winnings to essentially capture the governing institutions and bend them to their interests, leaving greater inequality, the hollowed out industrial communities that I mentioned. And more than that, and this is what I describe as the tyranny of merit, which I admit is a paradoxical turn of phrase, the tyranny of merit that tells the successful that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, that they therefore deserve the full bounty the market bestows upon them, and by implication that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. And this way of thinking about success became very influential. It was almost the moral companion to the neoliberal economic policy that created the inequality. It was a kind of meritocracy presents itself as an alternative to the inequalities of hierarchy, caste, aristocracy, cronyism, nepotism. But the way it worked during these 4 or 5 decades is that meritocracy provided a rationale for the growing inequality, not an alternative to it. And this produced so-called losers, not only economically, but as I was mentioning in the talk, in terms of recognition and self-esteem. Those without a degree felt that elites looked down on them and didn't respect the work they did. And when people feel, it's one thing not to get your fair share in a welfare state. And there you can say, all right, we have to fix the redistribution. We have to shore up the safety net. But it's another thing when people begin to feel that they're not valued, that the contributions they make don't matter, that what hedge fund managers do, that garners prestige, or famous athletes. But what working people do, plumbers, electricians, tradesmen, bus drivers, that the society kind of looks down. Well, it doesn't require the kinds of brains it takes to pass the entrance exams to get into the top schools. So I think it's it created a crisis of recognition, of honor and recognition, and that produces humiliation. And a politics of humiliation, which Trump is an expert at the politics of humiliation, that's more potent, that's more toxic, and it's more polarizing than a politics where people say, well, I didn't get my fair share. And that's what's produced the condition that we have now, which is to say it's a failure of the mainstream parties, center right and center left, that opened the way to Trump.
Maybe it is related to your comment, is that, generally speaking, or more generally speaking, that there has been always a gap between the theory and praxis. Maybe that would be one of the reasons that why we failed, to make the world safer or the more peaceful. But as a philosopher, I respect and I agree with you that the role of you mentioned young generations in Korea, the role of intellectuals, or even role of the ordinary citizens in a democratic society is very important. But as a philosopher, I think that the philosophy or ideas has emphasized that the assumption that human reasoning, awakening of the human reasons. That's important. But besides the awakening or enlightenment of human reasons, is there anything? Do we need something more, or something touched sentiment or emotions?
Yes.
Or even communal, cultural experience that we can share.
We do. We do. And here I think that center-left parties have made another mistake. We've been talking about what I take to be their economic mistakes and the hubristic embrace of meritocratic competition as a way of assigning rewards and honor and respect. But another mistake they made, and this goes to what you were mentioning about an emotional sense of allegiance, belonging, something that touches us. Center-left parties have allowed right-wing parties to gain a monopoly on patriotism. And center-left parties are not so good at invoking patriotism convincingly. It's as if they're a little bit allergic to it. And I think the reason is partly because they say, well, no, that's a right-wing thing, and nationalism leads to xenophobia and hostility to immigrants and these deportations. Once we start talking about patriotism, we're going down that road of intolerance and hatred of outsiders. But that's a mistake. Patriotism doesn't only mean xenophobia, doesn't have to mean xenophobia. It can also mean touching what we have in common. Shared history, shared identity, shared traditions that give rise to mutual obligations for one another. Center-left parties used to speak the language of solidarity. But solidarity is a language and a rhetoric and an ethic of belonging, of obligation, of shared identity, of mutual responsibility. It's another name for patriotism. So I think that if there's to be a revival, there's to be a challenge to the right-wing, populist, authoritarian type politics. It has to include, for the reasons that you mentioned, it can't all be purely reason-giving. It has to be community-evoking ties of allegiance and belonging. And there can be conservative versions of patriotism, and there can be progressive versions of patriotism, and a healthy debate can be about that. But I think one way to begin the debate, and this gets back to a concrete suggestion about what we could do beyond just reasoning, and I don't want to disparage reasoning together. We need, one of the most corrosive effects of the inequality of recent decades is that it has led us to live separate lives. Those who are affluent and those who are of modest means increasingly don't even encounter one another in the course of the day. We send our kids to different schools. We live and work and shop and play in different places. This isn't good for democracy. Democracy doesn't require perfect equality of income and wealth, but what it does require are public places and common spaces that bring people together from different walks of life in the ordinary course of their lives, whether it's sports stadia, or the municipal swimming pool, or public libraries, or public transportation, or public schools, or, as it used to be for us, but no longer, a shared obligation for either national service or sometimes military service. These were class-mixing institutions. People encountered one another from different classes. We have less and less of that. So part of healing the polarization, I think, depends on rebuilding the civic infrastructure of a common life, so that citizens encounter one another in the course of the day, in the course of their lives, because that recalls us to what it is we share, to our common citizenship. Now, I want to rescue reason for a minute, because I've been, at your invitation, a legitimate invitation, suggested two ways of trying to go beyond reason. But could I just say one word on behalf of the philosopher's vocation of dialogue, reason? Part of our problem is our public life is, our public discourse is hollowed out of larger meaning. What passes for political discourse, and social media makes this worse, is not reasoned argument, not listening to one another, but a volley of insults hurled at one another without really listening. So part of what we need is and educational institutions have to do a better job. The media has to provide forums for this kind of discourse. We need to cultivate the lost art of democratic public discourse, especially the art of listening. Listening not just to hear the words, but listening for the convictions lying behind the opinions of those with whom we disagree. That's a civic art. That's a civic virtue.
Okay.
We're not born knowing how to do it. We have to learn it.
Ordinary citizen spirit.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think?
You see, Professor, it's an unhappy news for you and for me
Yeah.
that we are supposed to finish up our session by 11:40.
Okay, but
And
we get to
I was also told that we have to open the questions or comments to the floor, because audience wants to ask you something. But we have only 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, okay.
Who is most courageous or brave? Okay, Dr. Kim Tae-ju, you are the only commentator or the question to Ms. Sanders.
I'm Tae-ju Kim, research fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy.
Yes.
My question is this. During the Korean War, both North and South Koreans got involved in massive killings of each other. The atrocious experience had been covered up, and war memories had been oppressed by the state during the Cold War. After the Cold War, however, the moral discourses of the war and violence has become prominent in everywhere, not just in Korea, but also other parts of the world. My question is this: why do you think the moral justice has become the cottage industry in local, national, and global politics, and how it can contribute to the reconciliation and cooperation in the Korean Peninsula?
Now, the cottage, just so I understand, Tae-ju, the cottage industry is memory or
The moral discourses.
moral discourses?
Yes.
Well, just to focus on the example you gave of memory, memories buried, memories brought to the surface as part of a moral discourse. I think you're right that the politics of memory today is a potent, powerful thing. And this is true in countries around the world. Because the politics of memory involves, well, how we understand our history and how that history bears on our present relationships. So there may be moments when it's better to set aside searing memories of injustice. But they never stay buried forever. Sooner or later, and we see this around the world. Those memories, we see it now, for example, the memories of Franco's Spain becoming a potent flashpoint of moral and political debate. We see it in the United States in the debate about honoring the Confederates and those statues that are torn down, and now Trump wants to put them back up. So the politics of memory is a way of coming to terms with the histories that connect us and also divide us. One, if I can give this example, one of the most moving dialogues that I was privileged to lead, to be a part of, was some years ago. I was doing a series on ethical dilemmas in Japan for NHK. And for one of the sessions, we brought together 10 students each, from Japan, South Korea, and China. And we brought them together in a studio, and we discussed the memory of the Second World War and how it was taught in their schools, and how and why those memories of the 1930s and the 40s, why those memories weigh so heavily on present-day relations among these three countries. Now, these were young people. These were university-age students. And I put questions to them, but really inviting them to talk to one another, sometimes in very concrete terms about what their textbooks had taught them and what they now question, and how they understood their relations with the people who were sitting right across from them. And they did beautifully. They spoke with strength, but with also compassion. They listened to one another. Some of them found themselves changing their minds along the way. But it seemed, I thought at the end of that conversation, if we can do this with 10 young people, it was a total of 30 young people from these three countries, there's no limit to what reasoned public dialogue, even about the hardest, most ethically fraught questions, including questions of memory, can be. And so that gives me hope. That gives me hope that despite the polarization we find today, we can do better, and the younger generation, I think, is going to demand that we do better, and good for them.
The Senator, unfortunately, time is up. You have next schedule after 11:40, so we have to finish our session, plenary session, by making my comments, fairly short comments, that I study international politics, and we're witnessing the world politics is transforming into a certain crisis or new types of international order. One of which is that bloc formation or the reorganization of supply chain. That reminds us that the discourse of geopolitics or even spheres of influence in the 1910s or 1920s, which was widely used in international relations. One of the alternative discourse to that, the resurrection of geopolitics is that communitarianism. We need to expand that ideas of communitarianism beyond the borders, or to the regional politics.
Yes.
I think the EU, European case was the one we see. We believe that is one good example.
Yeah.
So, and also that the communal spirit, as we can emphasize the importance of tolerance, or even the sense of diversity, or even living together, side by side. I think that the communitarianism could be also applied to the inter-Korean relations too. Still we believe some, not all, but in many of the South Korean people, or even the North, is saying, believe that we share the same culture, same history.
Yeah.
So we have a common.
Yes.
Maybe we could be called a community.
Right.
Korean national
Right.
community. So that is what I try to tell you, that I learned from you.
Oh,
I was so inspired about your philosophy and ideas.
thank you.
So
Thank you
so this is our last conversation. We should finish up. It's overextended. 이제 11시 40분까지 마치도록 되어 있는 plenary
So we were
session을
supposed
이제
to end by
마치겠습니다.
11:40, so I would like to wrap up the session. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Sandel for his participation in the debate and giving us the keynote session. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you so much.
대담에서 좋은 의견 나눠주신 두 분께 여러분 다시
Let us
한번
give a
더
big
큰
round
박수
of applause to
부탁드리겠습니다.
both of the gentlemen for their participation and contribution.